Have you ever noticed how some people simply stop arguing, say almost nothing, and suddenly become quiet? At first it may look like they gave up. Maybe you assume they no longer care, or that they just do not have anything left to say. But psychology suggests something much deeper can be happening in that moment. Sometimes, when a person goes silent, it is not because they lost the argument, it is because they made a decision. A decision so personal, so internal, that explaining it out loud would not even make sense anymore. Psychological research on emotional regulation shows that when people experience repeated conflict or emotional exhaustion, the brain often shifts from reaction to reflection. Instead of continuing the cycle of explanation, defense, and frustration, the mind begins to withdraw and reorganize its priorities. And this is where things become interesting. According to ideas associated with the analytical psychology of Carl Jung, many of the most important turning points in a person's life do not begin with dramatic actions. They begin with quiet internal realizations. A moment when someone stops trying to change another person and starts changing themselves instead. From the outside, it looks like silence. But internally, something powerful has just happened. In that quiet moment, the person may be making what feels like a promise, not necessarily to someone else, but to themselves. A promise about how they will move forward, how they will protect their energy, and what they will no longer tolerate. It is a silent commitment to a different path, and once that internal promise is made, behavior begins to change in ways that other people often do not understand right away. That is why someone who used to argue, explain everything, or seek validation can suddenly become calm, distant, and almost impossible to provoke. Their silence is not empty. It is the beginning of a psychological shift. And in today's video on Did You Already Know, you will discover why some people suddenly stop explaining themselves. What is happening inside the mind when someone reaches this silent turning point, and how a quiet internal decision can completely change the direction of a person's life. Because sometimes the most powerful promise a person makes is the one nobody hears. To understand why someone suddenly becomes silent, we first need to challenge a common misconception. Many people believe silence means weakness, avoidance, or emotional defeat. But psychological research shows that silence can actually be a complex form of emotional regulation. When a person repeatedly experiences the same conflict, disagreement, or emotional tension, the brain begins to recognize a pattern. If previous attempts to explain, argue, or clarify have not produced meaningful change, the mind slowly stops investing energy in that process. In psychology, this is often connected to what researchers describe as cognitive and emotional overload. When the brain is exposed to repeated stress in the same situation, it starts searching for a more efficient way to protect mental stability. Instead of continuing the cycle of reaction and frustration, the mind shifts toward distance and observation. At first, this change may be subtle. The person responds a little less. They explain themselves a little less. They stop trying to prove their point in every conversation. Over time, this reduction in reaction can turn into something that looks like complete silence. But internally, the mind is not shutting down. In fact, it is doing the opposite. It is processing. Neuroscience studies on emotional stress suggest that when people stop reacting impulsively, the brain activates areas related to reflection, long-term thinking, and self-evaluation. Instead of focusing on winning the argument or defending their position, the person begins asking deeper questions. Questions like, is this situation actually going to change? Is continuing this discussion helping anyone? And most importantly, what do I really want moving forward? This is the moment when emotional reactions begin to transform into psychological clarity. Carl Jung often emphasized that important inner shifts rarely happen during moments of loud confrontation. They tend to emerge during periods of inner reflection, when the individual starts confronting their own expectations, frustrations, and limits. Silence, in this context, becomes a space where the mind reorganizes itself. It allows the person to step outside the emotional storm of the moment and see the situation from a wider perspective. Instead of asking, "How do I win this argument?" the mind starts asking something much more important. Is this even the path I want to continue walking? And once that question appears, the person may be approaching a psychological turning point that will quietly change everything. At some point, after enough reflection, many people reach a moment that feels almost invisible from the outside, but internally it is extremely important. This is the psychological turning point. It does not happen with dramatic announcements. There is no long speech, no emotional declaration, and often no confrontation at all. Instead, it happens quietly. The person simply realizes something that changes the way they see the situation. Psychologists often describe this as a cognitive shift, a moment when the mind reorganizes how it interprets a relationship, a conflict, or even a life direction. What once felt urgent suddenly begins to feel unnecessary. Arguments that once seemed important start losing their emotional power, and when this happens, a new form of awareness begins to emerge. Instead of trying to control the behavior of others, the person starts focusing on something much more realistic, their own choices. Carl Jung spoke extensively about the process of individuation, which is the psychological development through which a person becomes more aligned with their authentic self rather than constantly adapting to external pressures. During this process, individuals often begin to question patterns that they previously accepted without thinking. They may realize that they were spending too much energy trying to gain understanding, approval, or change from someone who was never truly receptive. And once that realization becomes clear, something shifts internally. The person stops trying to fix the situation from the outside. Instead, they begin making internal decisions about how they will move forward. This is where silence often becomes more noticeable. Because when someone reaches this stage, they are no longer speaking from frustration or emotional reaction. They are observing, evaluating, and deciding. From the outside, it might look like distance, but internally, the mind is doing something very powerful. It is redefining priorities. The person begins to understand that not every conflict deserves continued attention, and not every relationship requires constant explanation. Some situations only continue because people keep feeding them with energy. And once someone realizes that they can simply stop feeding the cycle, the emotional dynamic begins to change. This is why the psychological turning point is so important. It is the moment when a person quietly moves from reaction to intention, from trying to convince others to deciding what they truly want for their own life. And often, this moment leads to the silent commitment that will shape everything that comes next. After the psychological turning point, something subtle but powerful often happens inside the mind. The person makes a decision. Not a public decision, not something they announce to everyone around them, but an internal commitment that quietly reshapes their behavior. This is what many people describe metaphorically as making a promise to the universe. In psychological terms, it is better understood as a deep internal commitment to change. Research in behavioral psychology shows that when people make strong, personal commitments, especially those connected to identity and values, their future actions begin to align with that decision, even if they never speak about it openly. This is why silence becomes so noticeable at this stage. The person is no longer trying to convince anyone. They are no longer trying to prove their point or demand understanding. Instead, they are directing their energy toward a different path. And this shift usually begins with a few quiet realizations. For example, someone may decide internally, "I will stop chasing explanations from people who refuse to listen," or "I will focus on my growth instead of repeating the same emotional battles." Sometimes the decision is even simpler, "I will protect my peace." These internal statements may never be spoken aloud, but they carry enormous psychological weight. According to concepts associated with Carl Jung's analytical psychology, important transformations often begin when a person aligns their conscious decisions with deeper parts of the psyche. When that alignment happens, the individual starts moving toward a more integrated and authentic version of themselves. In other words, the person stops living purely in reaction to external situations. They begin living according to an internal direction. And this is why the silent promise is so powerful. Because once someone makes that commitment internally, their behavior begins to change naturally. They may become calmer in situations that once triggered them. They may stop engaging in arguments that previously consumed their attention. They may also begin setting boundaries without feeling the need to justify them endlessly. To others, these changes can feel confusing. People often expect emotional reactions to remain predictable. When someone who used to react strongly suddenly becomes calm and distant, it can feel unexpected, even unsettling. But the explanation is usually very simple. The person is no longer operating from the same emotional position. They made a promise to themselves about how they will move forward. And once that promise exists internally, it quietly begins shaping every decision that follows. Once this silent promise is made, the most noticeable thing that begins to change is behavior. But these changes usually do not happen suddenly or dramatically. Instead, they appear in small, consistent ways that slowly reshape how the person interacts with the world. One of the first changes is emotional reaction. Situations that once triggered frustration, long explanations, or heated arguments start receiving much calmer responses. The person may listen, respond briefly, or sometimes choose not to respond at all. This is not indifference, it is emotional reallocation. Psychological studies on self-regulation and goal commitment show that when individuals make a strong internal decision about their priorities, their brain begins to filter situations differently. Energy is no longer invested in every conflict or misunderstanding. Instead, the mind becomes selective. The person begins asking themselves a simple internal question: does this situation deserve my energy? If the answer is no, they disengage. Another noticeable change is the reduction of the need for validation. Before the turning point, many people spend a great deal of emotional effort trying to be understood. They explain their intentions repeatedly, hoping the other person will eventually see their perspective. But after making an internal commitment to change direction, this need slowly fades. The person realizes that understanding cannot be forced. And once they accept that reality, they stop trying to control how others interpret them. Carl Jung often emphasized that psychological maturity involves moving away from constant dependence on external approval. As individuals develop greater self-awareness, they rely less on validation from others and more on their own internal sense of direction. This shift can create a noticeable difference in how someone carries themselves. They may speak less, but when they do speak, their words tend to be clearer and more intentional. They may spend more time focusing on personal goals, learning or improving aspects of their life that were previously neglected. And perhaps the most interesting change is this: they become harder to provoke. Situations that once created strong emotional reactions begin to lose their influence. The person has already decided internally what matters and what does not. So instead of reacting impulsively, they observe. Instead of arguing, they evaluate. And instead of trying to fix every misunderstanding, they focus on building a life that aligns with the promise they made to themselves. To others, This transformation can feel mysterious, but psychologically, it is a very natural result of a clear internal decision. When someone truly commits to a different direction in life, their actions slowly begin to reflect that choice, often without a single dramatic announcement. And that quiet transformation is often much more powerful than any argument could ever be. One of the most interesting parts of this silent transformation is that even without words, other people often begin to sense that something has changed. They may not immediately understand what happened, but they feel it. This reaction is not imaginary. Human beings are naturally wired to detect subtle emotional and behavioral signals in the people around them. Psychological research on social perception and emotional awareness shows that our brains constantly analyze small cues such as tone of voice, body language, facial expressions, and even response timing during conversations. When someone who used to react strongly suddenly becomes calm, distant, or selective with their attention, those signals change, and others notice. For example, a person who once responded immediately to every message may start taking longer to reply. Someone who previously tried to explain every misunderstanding may now respond with only a few calm sentences. In some situations, they may choose silence altogether. From the outside, this can feel confusing or even unsettling for the other person. Why? Because the emotional pattern they were used to has disappeared. Relationships often operate through predictable emotional dynamics. People learn how others typically react, and they unconsciously adjust their behavior based on those expectations. But when someone makes a strong internal commitment to change their priorities, those patterns are interrupted. The reactions become different, the emotional availability becomes more controlled, and the attention that was once freely given becomes more intentional. This is why people sometimes start asking questions like, "Why are you acting differently?" Or "Is something wrong?" In many cases, nothing is actually wrong. The person has simply reached a level of psychological clarity that changed how they distribute their emotional energy. Carl Jung believed that as individuals move closer to psychological maturity, they begin separating their identity from the expectations of others. Instead of constantly adapting to maintain harmony, they develop stronger internal boundaries. And once those boundaries exist, the person's presence begins to feel different, not colder, but more centered. Not distant in a hostile way, but emotionally independent. This independence can be surprising for people who were accustomed to a more reactive version of that person. But the truth is simple. The silence that once seemed temporary has now become part of a deeper transformation. The person is no longer responding from habit. They are responding from intention, and when that shift happens, the entire emotional dynamic between people can change, sometimes without a single explanation being spoken. When you look at it from this perspective, silence begins to take on a completely different meaning. It is not always a sign that someone has nothing to say, and it is not always a sign that they stopped caring. Sometimes silence appears when a person has finally understood something important about themselves, about the situation they are in, or about the direction they want their life to take. Instead of continuing the same emotional cycles, they make a quiet decision. They stop chasing explanations that never arrive. They stop repeating conversations that lead nowhere. And most importantly, they stop investing energy in patterns that prevent their own growth. From the outside, the change may seem small. After all, silence is easy to overlook. But psychologically, these moments can mark the beginning of a profound transformation. Carl Jung often emphasized that true personal development begins when individuals start listening to their inner reality instead of constantly reacting to the expectations around them. It is during these quiet moments of reflection that people begin to realign their actions with their deeper values. And once that internal promise is made, life gradually begins to move in a new direction, not because of a dramatic announcement, not because of a confrontation, but because one person quietly decided that their future would no longer be shaped by the same patterns of the past. Sometimes the most powerful promise a person makes is never spoken out loud. It is simply lived. Now think about this for a moment. Have you ever reached a point in your life where you stopped explaining yourself and quietly decided to move forward in a different direction? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else recognize their own turning point. And if you enjoy exploring the psychology behind human behavior, stay here with Did You Already Know?, where we uncover the hidden patterns that shape the way we think, act, and grow.